Hello everybody, so today's video is going to be a writing update, and bear with me, I know I just posted a writing update in May, but I realize that I write a lot more than I thought I did. Because of that, I think I need to update more frequently because this update is packed. So let's get started right away with some publication news. I've had a few publication related things happen to me. The first is I had a brand new short story published. It's the short story The Wolf Antelope Will Not Come For Us, which is featured in issue 76 of Filling Station, which I just so happen to have on me right now. Just look at how beautiful. The issue's called Into the Afterlife of This Touch, and it is the BIPOC artists issue. Check it out if you want to. I will link it. There are copies. Apparently it costs $12 Canadian. Like I said, my short story The Wolf Antelope Will Not Come For Us is featured in that, and it is a story about a young girl who is catering the funeral of a girl who is also her age, who was rumored to be murdered by a wolf antelope, when in reality there's some culty stuff going on. They live in a cult. I also wanted to mention that my twin sister Sarah is actually also in this issue, which is a huge coincidence. It was not on purpose at all, but her poem Lunar Phase is also featured in this issue. So if you'd like to support Sarah as well, you can pick up one of these copies, and there are so many writers that I admire that are in this issue. The next publication related thing is that my work has actually been anthologized. If you didn't know, my poem We Sell Skin on Sale, which was originally published in Augur magazine, was nominated for the 2021 Riesling Award, which Neil Gaiman won. My poem is in here, and do you see how magnificent this book is? It's huge. But look at this cover. Like, do we see this? Do you see this? It is beautiful. I also have a short story forthcoming. My short story, it's actually flash fiction. It's a little under 1,000 words. Fig will be published in Fractured Lit. I wrote that story around last year. I wrote it for a workshop. So now that we've chatted about publication news, let's jump right into talking about writing. I'm gonna obviously start with novels like I always do. So let's start with Feeding Habits, which is the first novel that I'm working on. Feeding Habits has been a work in progress. I have made so many videos documenting the process of writing this book. I started writing it in April of 2020. I am still writing it. I have hated writing it since April of 2020. I have been writing Lonan's point of view. In the last writing update, the last thing I talked about was that I'd written all of Harrison's point of view, which was about 24,000 words. It took me about 6 months to write. It was quite a long time it took me to write that 24K. And now I'm in the middle of the third part of the book. So part 1 was Lonan's point of view, part 2 was Harrison's point of view, part 3 we're back in Lonan's head. And so I have actually made the decision to write this final part of the book a little bit unconventionally. Of course, Feeding Habits previously has been structured pretty traditionally. It has been using the chapter method. The chapters are of a significant length. They're not super short. It's basically like a basic bitch like structure. I've jumped into Lonan's head, and the third part of this book, first of all, has been very emotionally draining to write. I don't really know what I'm doing, and I'm also really tired of writing it. So I thought, let me do something that won't require as much of like mini arcs. So chapters, I usually write them almost like little short stories. They usually have a pretty defined arc for every single chapter. They're not really spaces where we can just take a pause. They usually have an intention, and the chapter title will reflect that intention too. I also really like writing chapters where you'll just take a pause, like after a beat, but that's not the kind of chapter I'm writing in Feeding Habits. So I realized for part 3 I was way too tired, and also the way that the chapter is set up and the way the story is supposed to like work is really non-linear, so it won't work to separate it into chapters. I have yet to find a reason why I need to separate it into chapters, and I'm over 5,000 words into this chapter so far. The major reason I can't separate it into chapters is because of the non-linearity, and the book is also very purposefully confusing. So let's talk about my lack of clarity, because I have so much lack of clarity in everything that I'm doing. So lack of clarity in Feeding Habits has been a thing since I started writing part 3. I started writing part 3 in January of 2021. I didn't write it for about 4 months because I was in school, being a writing major, struggling during the pandemic, and I couldn't do it. I was writing a lot more short fiction at the time, and I picked it back up at the end of April, took a break from it until June. So it has been quite a lot of time writing part 3. And I have been purposefully writing it in this really clarity-free way because I do not have the emotional energy to make things clear right now. Let me just break all the rules that I know and let's just write something that makes no sense on purpose. Let's just fuck shit up. Why not? I think it may be because I'm writing a lot of flash fiction lately, and in general I'm also a poet, and in poetic works it's not that they're not clear. I'm not saying that at all, because poets know what they're doing. In poetic works, the narrative doesn't necessarily have to be so like ABC. It is quite fluid in some instances. At least that's how I write my poetry. I don't necessarily go in there having it make sense on the outside. It's really image based. It's really emotion focused. It's not necessarily so this happens and then this happens kind of thing. So I have taken that approach when writing part 3 because a lot of the scenes are like vignettes. I'm at the point where like after a scene is like 300 words, I'm like, nah, dude, I can't do it anymore. So I've definitely been using that to my advantage and just using it to change up the structure of the narrative. It also mirrors like Lonen's mindset, so it does make sense. Honestly, I feel like so far the chapter has been more kin to a prose poem than it has to like a chapter. To me, it feels like a long form poem, and I'm not mad at that. I definitely think that's what Feeding Habits is asking for at the moment. The chapter is actually called Swan Song, and it is broken into little mini chunks that have more lyrical titles, and I will name them. So the first part is Woman on Fire, and then I have Straight from the Hands, then I have Live Wire, and then I'm currently working on Remember a Body, or I might change it to Remember the Body. Really, my whole goal with Feeding Habits is to complete it. I don't really care what I have to do to get there, but I've been writing this book for so long at this point that I really need to move on from it. And I don't love doing this when it comes to books because I know that a year from now I'm going to reread Feeding Habits and be like, I really wish I had just like continued it. I had the exact same reaction when I finished Rewired. So Rewired is book 6 of Fostered, and that book took me from October of 2017 to April of 2019 to write. So about a year and a half. I remember I reread it this year and I was really disappointed in it because had I continued it, it probably would have, turned out quote unquote better. But I'm honestly kind of in the position again where like I can't sacrifice my like mental well-being to continue this book anymore. And plus there's a lot of things in writing where I feel like the train eventually sails, and I think the train has left the station for Feeding Habits. I'm not in the same mindset that I was when I was writing it last year, and because of that it is difficult to continue like with the continuity and stuff. It does feel a little bit disjointed. That's how Rewired also felt after a while. It just didn't feel cohesive at all, and I'm not looking for cohesivity when it comes to Feeding Habits. I'm just looking for enjoyment, and right now I'm not really enjoying it. Besides the fact that I just said I hate my book, I'm trying to be less cruel in my process, and that means allowing myself to do things that aren't necessarily the right thing to do. So I know the right thing to do would be to flesh all of the stuff out that I haven't, to clarify everything that doesn't really make any sense right now, to do this, that, or the other, but I don't need to do that right now. I can't. Like, my head, no, it does not want to do that right now. And so I've decided that what I'm going to do with Feeding Habits is I'm going to finish it. And because I actually like this book, like despite the fact that the I hate my book phase has hit me while I'm writing it, usually this doesn't happen. Usually that happens about 2 months after I finish a novel, but no. With Feeding Habits, I'm writing it in the this is embarrassing, I don't like this novel phase. I would like to give myself some time to just complete it, to let it go, and also to sort of enjoy as much as I can. So if that means doing things that are a little bit unconventional or not my plan, that's okay. I wanted to answer a question because last time I did a little mini Q&A as I was doing a writing update, and I really liked that. So the question is, do you ever stress about finishing projects? If so, how do you handle the stress? I certainly have been stressing about finishing Feeding Habits. I actually didn't think I was going to finish it. I think I was talking about this in a writing vlog that I'm filming right now, but I started writing 7th Virtue, which I'll get to if you don't know about 7th Virtue, as I was writing Feeding Habits. So I literally just started 7th Virtue like maybe about a month ago. And because of that, I was like, I don't think I'm going to finish Feeding Habits because 7th Virtue, I'm having way more fun writing it, and I feel very lost and like upset every time I write Feeding Habits, versus with 7th Virtue, I'm really enjoying it. But actually, right as I started having some difficulties with 7th Virtue, which I will get into, Feeding Habits came into my mind again because your girl knew that Hannibal was being taken off of Netflix. If you didn't know, Hannibal's my only personality trait. It's also very inspirational to Feeding Habits. Very similar tone, which is why I like to watch it as I am writing Feeding Habits. So when it was coming off of Netflix, I was like, let me just watch a few scenes. And that night, I went and I reread Feeding Habits, like a little bit of it, and I nearly cried. I had an emotional response because I was like, Rachel, this is very good. This book is really good. I really wish that you would be able to see that. But in a lot of ways, I know that I'm not there yet. I'm working on it though. But because I was watching that show and thinking about it, I started thinking about Feeding Habits again. And now I'm currently taking a break from Seventh Virtue so that I can write and finish Feeding Habits. I had to take off my jacket because it is too hot in here. So the next thing I wanted to update on was Moth Work 3. And I mentioned Moth Work 3 in the last writing update, which was literally like a month ago. I actually filmed it in March though, so it is a little bit outdated. And I thought I was going to write a Moth Work 3, but now that I'm writing Seventh Virtue, I actually don't feel that I am going to write a Moth Work 3, at least not in the foreseeable future. If I end up missing Moth Work, like the series, I miss my boys, I might write it, but I don't think I'm going to. I think I'm going to take a break from the Moth Work series. Let's get into the project everybody's probably the most excited about, and that's Seventh Virtue, which is an adult contemporary fantasy novel that I've been working on for like about a month or so. This book came out of nowhere, guys. This has been a really fun book to write. It was the book that I was writing in my 10,000 or 11,000 word day. I'm almost at 30,000 words, but it is actually going pretty badly, I would say, at the moment. And that is for a lot of factors, but I think the main one is that I am having a really hard time, I think, writing in the public eye. I think that might be what it is. I love so much that I have people on the internet who are interested in this series in particular that is never going to have an audience. It's never going to be published. I'm really not interested in publishing any of these books, and I made that decision years ago. But with Seventh Virtue, I have shared a lot of it since its conception. And I think, I don't know, it's getting to me like, and I think it also got to me with Feeding Habits at a point, and I'm going to talk about this later, so I won't get into it too much. I think knowing that there's like a bit of a phantom audience, even if it's not necessarily true, has been pretty difficult for me to wrap my head around. But in general, I just kind of took a break from writing the book, and that like maybe 1 or 2 break turned into a week-long break, which turned into a 2-week break, which turned into like a month-long break, basically. And so it's a little unfortunate, but I'm still feeling optimistic about it. I was doing a lot of world building, and I've gotten a few questions about world building. So the first one is, I know you're newer to world building in fantasy, but what was a moment where world building clicked? In your opinion, what are the most important areas of world building to focus on? So I've already talked in depth about what Seventh Virtue is about. I'll link it. I talked about it in a vlog, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. But a moment where world building clicked was when I figured out what the virtues are. Because if you didn't know, a lot of the time when I write things, they come from the title. So Seventh Virtue, the entire concept came from the title. A little bit of like a kind of fostered Easter egg is that Seventh Virtue was actually the original title to chapter 5 of Feeding Habits, which is called Holy Obedience now. I did change it because it made more sense to be Holy Obedience. So I had the title Seventh Virtue sitting in a document, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll use it for another chapter in Feeding Habits or in another book. But then when I was going through a title list, because I started Fostered But It's Magic, literally the day that I did the 10K word day, I didn't have a title for this book, I don't think. I was just calling it Fostered But It's Magic. And so I wanted to title it because I am the kind of writer where I cannot write without a title. It makes me feel very uncomfortable. So I went through the list, and this was the only one that sounded remotely fantasy enough. So that's the story of how I created Seventh Virtue. And so finally figuring out what the heck the Seventh Virtue was very helpful, because I was like, is the virtue a place? Is it a state of mind you have to get to? I think I was talking to my sister about it. We were brainstorming together, and I was like, what if the virtue is the bird? And we were both like, oh, thank God, like we figured it out. What are the most important areas of world building to focus on? I cannot give you this answer because I don't know anything about world building. People who are more experienced in world building, please let me know, because I don't feel qualified enough to answer that question. Any tips to create a good and fleshed out world, aka any tips on world building? What's worked for you and what hasn't? So I like this question because it asked what has worked for me and what hasn't worked for me. Tips on world building, the only one that is kind of quantifiable is one I mentioned already in a writing vlog, and that's to kind of like write out your world building as dialogue if that's how you plan to deliver that information. What worked for me was being very like a literary fiction writer about this. I was like, okay, so I have this idea and I have this word, virtue. What can I pull from that word? What can I symbolize about that word? What can I project onto that word? I was treating the word virtue as a sentient being, and I allowed it to kind of take shape and form. And that's how I write literary fiction. The words are almost kind of sentient. And so I did that with virtue, and I tried to keep rolling things in my head for about a week until I found one that was like, that I like. I really like that idea. I've also found what's worked for me is incorporating things I already know about. So for me, because it's my first time writing fantasy, if I had to do a whole bunch of research on something I don't know anything about, like for example, like hydraulics, like imagine, I don't know anything about, what even is that? I don't know. A lot of the magic system in Seventh Virtue is actually based off of tarot, and it's based off of Christianity. And so those are two things that I know. I mean, I know a lot about Christianity. I don't know as much about tarot and divination and stuff like that, but I am interested in it. I'm very much a noob when it comes to reading my own tarot cards, but I have a set that I really like, that I have like poured my energy into, and that is like really personal to me. And so I've used that sort of as an inspiration. This is the tarot deck that I have. It's a really beautiful deck, but as you can see, it is literally a bird deck of tarot cards. And so I've used this as like inspiration. I'm terrified of birds. I don't like looking at birds. They scare me. But I love like the aesthetic of birds, especially when they're drawings and not real, because I don't like small animals. I know. But I do love the aesthetic of birds. Lonen's name means blackbird, so I knew that was going to be like a big part of the book anyway. So I'm already taking things that I kind of already know about, plucking them and putting them into the book. I have been taking about a year to really get used to these cards and to like kind of befriend them and to get to know my deck. And because of that, I have also used some of that minimal knowledge to explore types of like magic systems in Seventh Virtue. So a lot of the lore, a lot of the symbolism is based off of tarot cards. And then I'll research along the way as I go. And then Christianity, for example, like I know a lot about because I went to Catholic school like my whole life. If I didn't know anything about anything, I think I would get really overwhelmed because world building is difficult. I also want to move on to not finishing the Fostered series. So the last writing update I posted, I got emo. I started crying. I was like, guys, I think Fostered is coming to an end, because I was like, I think Feeding Habits is done. I think I'm not going to write it. But then Seventh Virtue happened again. What's wonderful about writing, and this series in particular, is every single time I think there's a definitive answer to something, it surprises me. And it's like, actually, you were wrong. To shift back into genre fiction has felt like going home, and it's felt really comforting in a lot of ways. You know, literary fiction to me is so right now associated with academics that sometimes it's like difficult to enjoy writing it. I thought I wasn't going to finish Seventh Virtue. It would just be a first chapter, but I really like it. And I love what's happening. Like, I'm so excited. I get to bring back characters that I haven't written with in years. Like, I'm going to write with Chris, Lonan and Ryu's younger sibling, and I'm so excited to continue their storyline because they're such a compelling character to me, and they were gonna have a spin-off, but then they didn't have it, so they didn't get their chance to shine. And so I'm really excited to give Chris their own story now and kind of put them back into this world. And then Darren, does anybody remember Darren? It has been so long since I've talked about my boy, but he's the only character I've written who has his head screwed on straight, and I'm gonna give him a family, and it's gonna be a big family. They're gonna be Guyanese. I am excited to explore relationships that I thought I wouldn't ever explore again, because I was like, well, now I write literary fiction and these characters don't fit, so goodbye, even though I loved you. But no, my brain said, hello, welcome back to the party. So I got a question. Do you think your characters from Fostered have changed as you put them through different settings? To me, it seems like you actually build the settings around the characters to accommodate their personalities and arcs, which sounds like something I should think about. I'm struggling through my first book ever, and the fantasy world is kicking and screaming and goes wherever it wants. But I guess it's also different since you've known your characters for so long. I really, really relate to this person saying that their fantasy world is kicking and screaming. It is fantasy worlds, world building, it is such like toddlers. What this person said, I was like, you just psychoanalyzed me in the best way possible. Building the settings around the characters to accommodate for their personality and arcs is actually so true. I didn't realize that, probably because my characters and kind of what I write about like all sort of have like mutual like overlapping. For example, Feeding Habits deals a lot with religion and like struggling through religion, which is something relatable. So because of that, it's a huge part in Feeding Habits, but I didn't think it was going to make as much of like an impact on Seventh Virtue. I'm really excited to see that these elements are sort of like swirling around, because Lonan, I guess you could say one of his interests is religion. He's not really interested in it, but it is something that he deals with, and so it's something that is a part of his character. Do I think my characters have changed as I've put them through different settings? I actually filmed an entire podcast episode with my sister about this, so I'll be sure to upload that, so I won't go too much in depth on this question. But yes, the amount of things I've learned about these characters and their relationships across genres is phenomenal. If you're new here, Fostered started out as YA dystopian, then it went to adult dystopian-ish contemporary, then adult contemporary to adult literary fiction, and now it's adult contemporary fantasy. There's a lot to pick up on from this trend of switching and changing. How do the characters adapt? Because now it's not just Lonan and Harrison living in Susanna's apartment in New York City. It's Lonan and Harrison living in New York City that also has magic. So they're still living with Harrison's mother, but like it actually helps me write Feeding Habits. It's the reason why I'm feeling more comfortable to go and finish Feeding Habits, because now I've been able to see them in other lights and I can see that they can thrive in different ways. I can see how they react in different situations. A last thing I want to talk about for novels is audience expectation. The first question I have for this is, around what age did you grow out of feeling like you had to publish everything you wrote someday? The answer to this is pretty boring. I made that decision when I was 13. So I started writing when I was 12. I started writing in May of 2014. And I turned 13 in September of 2014. It was at that point, at around maybe March of 2015, that I decided I'm not gonna publish everything. It's fine. And I don't know really how I got to that mindset. It's a pretty big leap. I got another question. When you listen to booktubers reviewing and analyzing books written by authors, do you ever get this crippling anxiety and just think, OMG, what if my book was ever reviewed on here and it bombed as bad as X book? Do you ever get this? The anxiety's crippling. How do you get over this? And at first I was like, no, I don't feel this way. And then I realized, Rachel, you have been struggling with audience expectation for about a year. And maybe it's because my audience has grown, but I've definitely been struggling with the idea of, what if I put this out on my YouTube and like my audience is really disappointed with the way it goes? Like, it's the reason why I like kind of really struggled with Feeding Habits is because I started sharing it on audiobook form here. And since then, and even before then, I was sharing dozens of excerpts, basically the entire chapter of Feeding Habits on my blog. So if you ever want to know like what else has happened beyond chapter 4 in Feeding Habits, it's all on my blog. I have definitely been struggling with like balancing that, because I'm like, what if like Lonan does something in chapter 5 of Feeding Habits and everybody hates him for it and they're like, I hate your book now. And it's not something that I was really like concerned with when I initially started sharing things, and I don't know if I have to be concerned with it now, because I have the loveliest audience and everybody is so supportive of everything I do, which I really appreciate. And I think I have an audience that's really respectful of my work and that it is personal work for me. Definitely does give me a little bit of anxiety sometimes to share things, and is the reason why I think I'm not going to share that much of Seventh Virtue on here. I originally was going to read like the first chapter like audiobook style for Seventh Virtue, but I don't think I'm ready to do that yet, and I think I'm gonna try to like rein it in on sharing stuff on the internet. Not because I dislike it, I actually really love sharing my stuff, but because I think in the long term it will be a little bit more beneficial. Like maybe after I finish the draft, I can share a little bit more. So it's not really people reviewing my books that bug me, because I don't write for authortube. I don't really treat my authortube platform as a marketing tactic like some people do, and I personally don't. If a book of mine ever comes out, I don't expect you to go and buy it. I don't expect you to read it. I just appreciate that you're subscribed to my channel. So if people do review it on here, like, it's okay, but I wouldn't view it like my book if it came out as an authortube book, because it's just my book that I happen to be putting out, and I happen to have this social media. I think in a lot of ways, I've had to I've had a reckoning inside of myself, and I've had to say, Rachel, you don't have control over what people think about your book, but you do have control about what you think about it. Don't stress about what other people are gonna think when you don't know what other people are thinking. And even if people make that clear in a video or in a comment, and most of the times I haven't gotten one negative comment on my writing on my channel, which I really appreciate. And I've been making content for about 5 years now. And so it's really amazing that I have just had positivity outpouring. But I don't know what you're thinking, and I can't change what you're thinking. And I know that I'm sharing my work because I love my work, and that's okay. So I think like kind of recontextualizing that it's still okay to love something even if other people dislike it, especially when it comes from your heart. I think that might help perhaps. Let's really quickly run through poetry. So I've been writing a few poems, not that many. A few of them I forgot to mention in the last writing update. So the first poem that I've written recently, this is in no particular order. This one I wrote called My Past Bodies Walk Into a Room. I've been contemplating body image a lot more in my poetry, and like how I view myself, and like as a chubby person, like how I kind of navigate the world, and as somebody who has been pretty body conscious their whole life. I wrote a poem called Reunion, which I actually wrote for my poetry workshop, which ended a few months ago. I also wrote a poem called Belly, which again is body image related. I also wrote a poem called Is It Too Late to Make a Turducken, which is a poem I've been working on for so long. I don't know if this is going to be the final turducken poem. I feel like the turducken poems should be a series of poems. This one is really loose. It's more an exploration in phonetics than it is like a exploration in narrative. The next poem I wrote was The Evening We Read Each Other's Palms in the Dark, which is actually a rewrite of another poem that I wrote, again, for my workshop. I didn't end up liking the original draft of this. I don't know if I like the final draft of this, but I do like it and what it's trying to do. It's basically 3 poems in one, so you can read it as a whole. You could read one side and then one side. And then I also wrote a poem called The Children's Play Store Alarm. I also wrote a poem yesterday called What is the Difference Between Good and God? I also want to talk about short stories and how they're going. So if you didn't know, I have a goal to write 1 short story a month. It doesn't matter how long the short story is, as long as it's a contained story. Any tips on writing productively and outlining efficiently? I put this question here because writing productively, I can definitely give you some tips. Of course, my channel isn't really about productivity, but if you do want some more actionable suggestions, I recommend writing your drafts fast. To me, what's helpful in writing more productively is not getting hung up on every single word that I'm writing, which I do. That's just my personality. I also recommend keeping a consistent goal. So this week I'm trying to write feeding habits every single day, at least 1 sentence a day. And outlining efficiently, unfortunately I don't outline. So if there are outliners, let me know. What are the stories I've written since the last writing update? I wrote a story called Where to Run When the Lamb Roars, which is a little over 2,100 words long. This story is about a brother and a sister who are actually a murderous duo. Is this narrator okay? Probably not. I also wrote a story called 5 Times Fast. It's a little over 300 words. This is a story about a woman who has like a friends with benefits relationship with a guy who works at a laundromat. And so it takes place in a laundromat. There's a lot of Elvis in that story. Don't ask. I also wrote Carousel Pony, which I forgot that I wrote. I don't know the word count. It might be a little under 200 words. That story is about like a child who goes to a carousel and they spot like a pony that they really are in love with and that they want to ride, but it's kind of also about them not having like a mother figure that is there for them at the time. It's actually a pretty efficient piece, I think. If you've ever been to Canada's Wonderland and you see the green horse on the carousel, it's that horse. I also wrote another carousel story called Carousel Horse, and I actually forgot that I'd written Carousel Pony. So one of the titles are going to change. Carousel Horse, which is the short story, is actually going to change. It's a really short story. It's just a little over 1,100 words. And I also wrote another flash fiction piece, which was 567 words, called Jeremy, and it's about a cake decorator who is really tired of spelling the name Jeremy on cakes. She's like, it's the most common name and it's the worst one to spell for XYZ reasons. When a mother and child named Jeremy comes in to pick up a birthday cake. I've also been thinking a lot about careers. So this is the section of the video called Trouble in Literary Fiction Paradise. And I got this question, what is literary fiction? And usually, and I did reply to this person and I give them like a resource. And usually I would just give a resource. But then it got me thinking. I got pretty existential about it. I was like, what is literary fiction? Like I said, I've been writing literary fiction for about 3 years. I write a lot of literary short fiction in particular. I have not written a literary fiction novel though. And I've been thinking about a writing career and kind of my writing future because I've been writing genre fiction again. I never in a million years thought I would ever write genre fiction again, which is kind of stupid because I was like, Rachel, you really think that like one decision you made when you were 16 years old was going to be the decision for the rest of your life? Like, no. I've also been thinking about, and this is the part where we're going to talk about some difficult topics such as race. So please, if this is like too triggering for you, skip past this part. I will have the timestamps. But also, if you don't have anything nice to say, please don't comment because this is really difficult stuff to wade through. Your girl has been struggling with like racial trauma. I think the world for BIPOC has been very difficult. It's like every month there's a new tragedy. It's been affecting the way that I think about writing and the way that I think about the literary scene. And, you know, literary fiction obviously is kind of like a historically white man fiction. I have had a blast really kind of dismantling that idea and also kind of reclaiming it, because I do think it is a fantastic thing for people of color to have space in a historically white saturated industry, whether it's saturated with white men or white women. It is, I think, a testament to break through this industry that is historically white. At the same time, I have been really struggling finding my place as a literary fiction writer. In a lot of ways, I'm not ready in my life to write a story like about culture. And in a lot of ways, I think the publishing industry kind of wants to capitalize off of culture stories and issue stories, which is why I am asking if anybody has recommendations for literary fiction books that are written by BIPOC authors that aren't culture or issue stories. Please let me know. I actually think these stories are super important, so I'm not saying that I don't ever want to read them ever. I'm not mentally capable of that right now. It has been definitely difficult to wager what literary fiction means to me right now, especially because I'm writing genre fiction now. I'm also writing literary fiction at the same time too, and I've been writing literary fiction for a long time. I think in a lot of ways, literary fiction became my identity, and it's because I was 16 when I started writing literary fiction, so everything became my identity when I was 16, but literary fiction is not something that I let go of. Starting Seventh Virtue has really sobered me and really humbled me. I also think that there is simultaneously a space for people like me in literary fiction, but I am also a little jaded, I think, about literary fiction at the moment, just a little bit. I've noticed that a lot of the books that I particularly love, that I've called my favorite books, that, I mean, I still like them, but I can point out some of their faults, often rely on girls of color like myself to almost be amplifiers of like the white teenage protagonists. And so I'm not really asking for advice on this one. It's just more like me talking. If you are a literary fiction writer, let me know, especially if you're a BIPOC literary fiction writer, let me know how you've traversed the world of white literary fiction, especially when I'm talking about white canlit. It is super white and canlit. So trying to break that as a BIPOC author has been really difficult, I think. It's not like I'm giving up on literary fiction or that I don't ever want to write it ever again. I actually really love writing literary fiction. I love writing literary short stories, but it's when it comes to a literary novel that something is not fitting right in there. I don't know what it is. Feeding Habits is literary fiction to an extent. I would say it's about 90% literary fiction. It is a story that like I'm very familiar with it, so it's not like very uncomfortable. And also Feeding Habits is very white. Eliza is not white, but other than that, like my boys are very white because they were characters that I created while I was having difficulties accepting myself. I accept myself now. I love myself. Like, hello, look at me. I'm beautiful. I know my worth. And so it's become kind of tricky, I think, to navigate. It has been hard. My life is affected by being a person of color, but I do not wake up every day and be like, yes, today I am a brown woman. The rest of my day is going to be super brown. Like, that's not how I write. With that, that's going to be the end of this writing update. Let me know what you have been working on. I would love to hear how writing is going for you. And I hope that everybody is staying safe and that you're having a wonderful June. And if you're not, I'm sending you all of my love and all of my good vibes. And I'm wishing you all of the best for the future. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in another video. Bye!